There was a time when mirrors were simply part of my home, blending quietly into the background. I learned to move around them, treating them as obstacles rather than objects of attention. I trained myself not to look. My avoidance was subtle and persistent, never dramatic. There were no shattered mirrors or draped cloths, just a quiet, ongoing habit of looking away. I made a silent pact with myself to look away. I'd allow myself a brief glance, just enough to check my hair or collar, but never long enough to truly see the person staring back. This avoidance wasn't about dissatisfaction, which is outwardly. It came from something much deeper, a fear that settled in my stomach, a dread of what I might discover if I truly met my own eyes. This quiet retreat from my reflection became a daily habit. As automatic as making coffee in the morning, I perfected the sidelong glance, the quick scan that caught only the surface, never the substance. I could tell you the color of my shirt, but not the emotion in my eyes. I could spot a stray eyelash, but not the exhaustion written in the lines around my mouth. It was a defense mechanism, a wall built not from bricks, but from hurried steps and averted eyes. The fear wasn't about flaws or aging. The fear was of seeing the truth, the unfiltered story of my life, written in the language of my own expression. It was the fear of facing the quiet anxieties and unspoken disappointments I carried every day. Outside the mirror, life was manageable. I could perform the version of myself that was expected, polished, composed. I could smile, nod, and move through the world with a carefully crafted persona. But the mirror offered no such stage. It was a silent audience of one, demanding an honesty I wasn't ready to give. To truly look was to stand at the edge of a precipice. The surface seemed calm, but beneath it churned a sea of feelings I'd spent years suppressing. The fear was a quiet, constant hum in my life, a reminder that to see myself was to confront myself, and I felt too fragile for that confrontation. So, the dance continued. I'd wash my hands, eyes fixed on the swirling water, deliberately avoiding the mirror just above. I'd walk down hallways lined with mirrors, my gaze locked on the floor. This wasn't a decision I made in a single moment. It was a slow erosion of courage, a gradual surrender to a fear that grew as I continued to avoid it. I wasn't afraid of my reflection, but of the person in the mirror, because I suspected she knew all the secrets I tried to hide, even from myself. She was the keeper of my fatigue, the witness to my silent struggles, the one who knew the true weight of the mask I wore for the world. To meet her eyes would be to confess everything without saying a word. We are taught to think of mirrors as simple tools of reflection, just inert objects made of glass and a thin layer of silver. They are supposed to show us what is there, a direct, honest duplication of the physical world. We use them to check our reflection, to tie a tie, to apply lipstick, to make sure we present an acceptable face to the world. But this functional understanding of a mirror is profoundly incomplete, a hollow definition for an object that holds so much power over our internal lives. A mirror is never just glass, it is a portal. It does not simply reflect the light that falls upon our skin. It seems to penetrate deeper, exposing the intricate, often chaotic landscape that lies just beneath the surface. It is a silent conversationalist, a quiet interrogator that asks the questions we are too afraid to ask ourselves. The mirror became my most honest and most feared critic. It didn't care about the confident facade I presented in meetings or the easy smile I offered to strangers. It saw past the performance. In the stillness of a quiet morning, it would reveal the subtle tremor of doubt in my eyes, a flicker of uncertainty that no one else was close enough to see. It would highlight the tense clench in my jaw, a physical manifestation of the stress I insisted I was handling just fine. The mirror was a brutal archivist of my emotional state, cataloging the weariness that clung to my posture and the quiet resignation that softened the edges of my smile. It was a canvas where the invisible burdens of my life took on a visible, undeniable form, making them impossible to ignore, if only for a moment. This is why we truly avoid mirrors. It isn't about vanity or the fear of aging or the judgment of our physical form. We avoid mirrors because we avoid meeting ourselves. We avoid the silent, piercing honesty of our own gaze. In that reflection, there is no room for the carefully constructed narratives we tell others. There is no space for the excuses, the justifications, or the polite fictions we use to navigate our days. The mirror demands a raw, unedited encounter with the self. It holds up a reflection not just of our face, but of our spirit, our resilience, our sorrow, and all the dreams we have quietly packed away and labeled as impractical or childish. It is a confrontation with the person we are right now, stripped of all pretense and performance. And so, the act of looking away becomes an act of self-preservation, a desperate attempt to keep the inner world separate from the outer one. We fear that if we look too closely, the carefully maintained dam will break, and all the emotions we have held back will come flooding forth. We fear that the exhaustion we feel will finally become visible to us, that the sadness we've buried will stare back with an unbearable intensity. The mirror doesn't just show us our face, it shows us our life. It reflects the compromises we've made, the passions we've neglected, and the quiet aches we've chosen to ignore. It is a stark and silent testament to our own existence, and sometimes the truth of that existence is a heavy weight to bear. The surface of a mirror is a silent stage where the ghosts of our unspoken feelings perform their quiet dramas. It is in the stillness of a reflection that we can often see the echoes of our inner world made manifest. The dreams that have been deferred or abandoned do not simply vanish. They leave a trace. They linger in the periphery of our vision, in the slight downward turn of a mouth that is trying its best to smile, or in the vacant quality of a gaze that seems to be looking at something far beyond the room. These are the subtle clues, the quiet confessions that the mirror offers up without judgment. It shows us the parts of ourselves that have been gently, almost imperceptibly, worn down by the weight of expectations and the slow grind of daily obligations. I began to see these echoes in my own reflection during those brief accidental encounters. I would catch a glimpse of myself in a shop window and see not a woman walking with purpose but a figure carrying an invisible load. The reflection showed me a tiredness that no amount of sleep seemed to cure, a weariness that was soul deep. It was the exhaustion that comes from constantly upholding a version of yourself that is not entirely true. It was the fatigue of relentless self-monitoring, of ensuring every word and action aligned with a persona of competence and calm. The dreams that were quietly dying behind my smile were the most painful echoes of all. They were the passions I had set aside for a more practical path, The creative impulses I had dismissed as frivolous, the adventures I had postponed for one day. The mirror became a repository for these fading dreams. It held the reflection of the painter who never picked up her brushes, the writer who never filled his notebooks, the traveler who never bought her ticket. It reflected the cumulative effect of 1,000 tiny compromises, each one seeming insignificant on its own, but together creating a tapestry of quiet regret. This is a profound and unsettling experience, to see the ghost of who you might have been looking back at you through the eyes of who you have become. It is a silent reckoning with the choices made and the paths not taken. The mirror does not condemn, it simply reveals. It holds up the evidence of a life lived, and sometimes that evidence includes the beautiful things that were allowed to wither. This is the deeper fear that drove my avoidance. It was not the fear of what was there, but the fear of what was no longer there. It was the fear of confronting the slow, quiet erosion of my own vibrant spirit. It was the fear of acknowledging that the bright, hopeful person I once was had been gradually replaced by someone more cautious, more pragmatic, and infinitely more tired. To look in the mirror was to face the consequences of my own choices, to see the space where a fire used to be, now filled with little more than cooling embers. It was a confirmation of a loss I felt deep inside, but refused to name. The mirror gave that loss a face, and that face was my own. Every sideways glance, every hurried look away from a reflective surface was a silent confession. It was an admission of a truth I wasn't ready to speak aloud. I was afraid of the person I was becoming, or perhaps more accurately, I was afraid of the person I was failing to become. Each averted gaze was a small act of cowardice, a choice to remain in the comfortable shadows of denial rather than step into the harsh, revealing light of self-awareness. It's a subtle form of hiding, not from the world, but from oneself. You can walk through a crowded room with your head held high, yet still be in hiding, shielding your own spirit from the piercing clarity of your own eyes. This internal retreat is the most isolating of all. The irony is that in trying to avoid the perceived judgment of the mirror, I was passing a much harsher judgment on myself. My refusal to look was a statement. It said, "You are not worth seeing." It said, "The truth of your emotional state is too much to handle." It said, "It is better to live with a comfortable lie than to face an uncomfortable reality." This constant act of self-effacement chips away at your sense of self-worth in a way that no external criticism ever could. It reinforces the idea that some parts of you are unacceptable, that they must be hidden away, even from your own consciousness. The mirror itself holds no opinion. It is a neutral observer. The judgment, the fear, and the shame are all things we project onto it from within. This fear of recognition is a universal human experience, though it manifests in different ways for each of us. We fear seeing the sadness we've tried to bury, the anger we've been told is unseemly, or the vulnerability we mistake for weakness. We fear seeing the reflection of our parents in our own tired expressions, realizing we have inherited the very anxieties we swore we would overcome. We fear recognizing the stranger we have become, a person who navigates life based on a set of rules and expectations that feel foreign to our own core being. To truly see ourselves is to be fully accountable for our own lives, and that level of responsibility can feel terrifyingly immense. Thus, the mirror becomes more than a piece of furniture. It becomes a symbol of a deeper internal struggle. It represents the dividing line between the self we present to the world and the self we are when no one is watching. For me, it was the ultimate arbiter of truth, a silent witness to the growing chasm between my carefully constructed exterior and my increasingly fragile interior. The fear was simple. If I looked for too long, I might not be able to look away. I might see something so honest, so broken, or so yearning that I would no longer be able to pretend it wasn't there. And that recognition would demand change, an upheaval I was not yet brave enough to begin. There comes a point in this prolonged avoidance where your own face begins to feel like a foreign land. The features are familiar, of course, the same nose, the same eyes, the same shape of the mouth, but the person inhabiting them feels like a stranger. It is a deeply disorienting feeling, like hearing your own voice on a recording and not recognizing it. The face in the mirror becomes a map of a place you used to know intimately but can no longer navigate. You see the lines around your eyes not as markers of laughter and life, but as unfamiliar roads leading to a destination you do not recognize. This is the profound alienation that comes from looking without truly seeing, from acknowledging the surface without ever daring to explore the depths. I began to study this stranger's face in stolen moments with a kind of detached, almost clinical curiosity. I would notice the way her brow furrowed slightly even when she was resting, as if perpetually mulling over a problem she couldn't solve. I saw a tension in her lips that belied the calm words she so often spoke. It was as if I were an outsider observing a subject, taking notes on a life that was not my own. This detachment was another layer of defense, a way to create distance between the person I believed I was and the weary individual who was actually reflected in the glass. It was easier to analyze this stranger than to claim her as my own, easier to pity her than to feel her pain directly. It was a way of saying, that isn't me, that is just what the stress looks like. This sense of estrangement is a quiet sorrow. It's the feeling of being a tourist in your own life. You go through the motions, visit the landmarks of your day, work, home, family, friends, but you feel disconnected from the experience, as if watching it all happen from behind a thick pane of glass. The person in the mirror is the one living that life, the one bearing its weight, while the real you, the essential you, feels trapped somewhere deeper inside, unheard and unseen. This internal fracture, this split between the actor and the observer, is exhausting. It is a constant, low-grade hum of dissonance that underscores every moment, a feeling that you are not quite home in your own skin, in your own body. The mirror, in its unflinching honesty, simply reflects this fracture back at you. It doesn't create the stranger, it merely reveals that she has taken up residence. It shows you the mask that has been worn for so long that it has begun to merge with the skin beneath. The fear then evolves. It is no longer just the fear of seeing a fleeting, painful emotion. It becomes the fear that the stranger is all that is left. The fear that the true self, the one you remember from a decade ago, has been lost for good. buried so deep beneath layers of politeness, pressure, and performance that she may never find her way back to the surface. And the face staring back at you is the only proof you have of this quiet, devastating disappearance. Ultimately, a mirror does not just show us our face, it shows us our world, the world we have built inside ourselves. If that world is filled with self-criticism, with unspoken grief, with relentless pressure, then that is the landscape we will see reflected in our own eyes. The mirror becomes a dark and stormy sea, a place of turbulence and threat. But if our inner world is one of gentleness, of self-compassion, of quiet acceptance, the mirror becomes a calm harbor, a place of safety and rest. The glass itself does not change. Its reflective properties remain constant. What changes is the very source of the light it is reflecting, the state of our own soul. We are not afraid of the mirror. We are afraid of the world it shows us we have created within. This is the central truth I began to slowly, painfully understand. My fear was a compass pointing directly toward the parts of my inner life that were in desperate need of attention. The exhaustion in my reflection was a mirror of the exhaustion in my spirit. The sadness in my eyes was a reflection of the ungrieved losses I carried. The tension in my jaw was a reflection of the battles I was fighting silently every single day. The mirror was not the source of the pain, it was simply the messenger, delivering a report from the front lines of my own interior life. And like so many others, I was trying to silence the messenger because I was not ready to hear the news, not yet strong enough to face the war. We think we want to change what we see in the mirror. We want to see a face that is happier, less tired, more confident. We buy creams to erase the lines and makeup to cover the shadows. But this is like trying to change the reflection in a pond by rearranging the water. The true work is not on the surface. The true work is to change the reality that is being reflected. It means tending to the inner world with the same care we might give to a garden. It means weeding out the harsh judgments, watering the seeds of self-compassion, and making sure there is enough sunlight of joy and rest to allow things to grow. When the inner landscape begins to heal, the reflection takes care of itself. The mirror then isn't just glass. It is a diagnostic tool for the soul. It is the most honest feedback we will ever receive, offered without agenda or malice. It simply shows what is. Our reaction to that reflection, our fear, our avoidance, our judgment, tells us everything we need to know about our relationship with ourselves. My journey began with the fear of that reflection, the fear of what it exposed about my inner reality. But to heal, I would have to learn to stand still, to look past the stranger, and to see the reflection not as an indictment, but as an invitation to come home to myself, to begin the quiet, courageous work of tending to the world within. It happened on a day that held no particular significance, a day that promised nothing more than the gentle, monotonous rhythm of routine. It was a Tuesday, I think, one of those grey, unassuming days that serves as a quiet bridge between the memory of the weekend and the hope of the next one. There was no dramatic crescendo, no thunderclap of revelation. The moment that changed everything arrived without announcement, wrapped in the most ordinary of circumstances. I was standing in the bathroom after a shower, a towel wrapped around me, the air thick with steam. The mirror was fogged over, a milky, opaque surface that offered a merciful blur, a temporary reprieve from the reflection I so often avoided. I was simply going through the motions, lost in a reverie of tasks to be done, emails to be answered, and errands to be run. But then something shifted. As I reached for a cloth to wipe the glass, my hand paused mid-air. I don't know why. Perhaps it was the profound silence of the house, or the way the muted light filtered through the frosted window, but for the first time in a long time, I felt no urge to hurry. I was not rushing to get dressed, not scrambling to begin the performance of my day. I was just there, suspended in a pocket of time. I stood accidentally still. My breath was soft, my body relaxed. In this unplanned moment of quiet, the steam on the mirror began to recede on its own, not wiped away in a frantic swipe, but slowly, organically, like a fog lifting from a morning field. It was a slow, deliberate reveal, and I found myself watching it, mesmerized. The clearing was not uniform. It started from the center, a small clear circle that gradually expanded, pushing the white mist to the edges of the glass. And in that slowly growing circle of clarity, a face began to emerge, my face. But it felt different this time because I had not forced the encounter, because it had happened upon me so gently. The usual defenses were not in place. My internal guard was down, my usual instinct to look away was dormant. I was simply an observer, a witness to this slow unveiling. There was no judgment in my heart, no fear in my gut. There was only a deep, profound stillness, both within me and in the room around me. The world seemed to hold its breath with me. This accidental stillness was a gift. It was a space I had not known how to create for myself, a pause I had not realized I so desperately needed. In the hustle of my life, stillness had become a luxury I couldn't afford when it was always associated with idleness or failure. But here it was, uninvited and utterly transformative. It disarmed me completely. It stripped away the armor of busyness and the shield of distraction. In that quiet moment, standing before a slowly clearing mirror, I was not a professional, not a partner, not a daughter, not a friend. I was just a soul breathing in a steamy room, waiting to see who would look back at me when the last of the fog finally dissolved. And I was not afraid, I was just ready. As the last wisps of steam vanished, her face came into full view, and I saw her, really saw her, perhaps for the first time. The features were mine. The architecture of the face was one I had known my entire life, but the person looking out from behind the eyes was someone I had not met in a very long time. Her gaze was not angry, not accusatory, not even particularly sad. It was something far more unsettling. It was direct. There was an unnerving clarity in her eyes, a piercing stillness that cut through all my pretenses. It was the gaze of someone who had been waiting patiently, someone who had seen everything and was no longer interested in the stories I told myself. It was a look that said simply, "There you are. I've been waiting." The woman in the mirror did not look like the stranger I had been observing with clinical detachment for so long. This was not a subject to be analyzed. This was a presence to be reckoned with. The stranger was a two-dimensional figure, a collection of tired features, But this person, this woman in the glass, had depth. She had a history. I could feel the weight of her unspoken thoughts, the gravity of her silent endurance. Her eyes held a profound knowledge that I had been actively trying to suppress. They knew the cost of every polite smile, the weight of every swallowed opinion, the slow corrosive effect of constantly putting the needs and expectations of others before her own. This was not a reflection of my exhaustion, this was the source of it. In her stillness, I saw a quiet power I did not recognize as my own. The person I performed for the world was accommodating, flexible, eager to please. She smoothed over conflict and absorbed tension. But the woman in the mirror was not accommodating. She was still. She was rooted. There was an amazing quality to her, a rather sense of deep, unshakable core that had been there all along, buried but not broken. She was not fragile. She was not a victim. She was a survivor of a long, quiet war I had been waging against my own soul. Her presence was a silent testament to a resilience I had never given myself credit for, a strength that had persisted despite my best efforts to ignore it. And so I just stood there, meeting her gaze. The seconds stretched into a minute, then two. The usual urge to break contact, to look down, to find a distraction never came. I was held captive by the sheer honesty of her expression. It was a silent, profound conversation. She did not need to speak. Her eyes communicated everything. They asked the questions I had been too afraid to even form in my own mind. How long will you keep hiding? When will you let me breathe? Don't you remember who you are? It was not an interrogation, but an invitation to stop running, to stop hiding, and to finally acknowledge the person I had tried so hard to bury. As I looked deeper, I saw her, the girl I used to be, fierce and unapologetic. She was still there beneath the layers of compromise and exhaustion, a living presence behind my eyes. I realized I'd spent years hiding her, trading her fire for acceptance, her voice for quiet. She wasn't angry, just tired of being hidden, yearning to be seen again. Grief washed over me for the years I'd silenced her, for becoming my own jailer. In that moment, I knew I wasn't afraid of the mirror. I was afraid of facing her. The reflection's weariness was deeper than fatigue. It was the exhaustion of living a life that wasn't truly mine. Every day was a battle between who I was and who I pretended to be. The walls I built for protection had become a prison, trapping my authentic self inside. I was both prisoner and guard, drained by the effort of hiding. The tiredness in my eyes was a silent plea. I can't keep doing this. It was time to call a truce with myself. That day everything shifted, not with drama but with quiet certainty. My real fear wasn't judgment, it was forgetting the girl I once was. The mirror forced me to remember, to see what was at stake, my soul, not my looks. I could no longer hide behind performance or denial. A new determination stirred to reclaim the self I'd buried. The journey ahead was about remembering, not perfecting. After turning from the mirror, the world felt unchanged, but I was different. The reckoning was quiet, a shift in how I moved, spoke, and chose. The woman in the mirror became my silent guide, reminding me to pause before betraying myself. Change was slow, but now I saw the choice. That day wasn't an ending, but the start of reclaiming my story. I resolved to write the next chapter with honesty. The mirror, once a source of fear, became my teacher. It reflected not just my face, but my progress, my exhaustion, my sparks of defiance, my moments of self-compassion. Each glance was a lesson in honesty, a map of where I've been and where I needed to go. The fear faded, replaced by a willingness to see and change. The mirror became an active participant in my healing, offering truth without judgment. It taught me to find my way back to the person I'd almost forgotten. My relationship with the mirror evolved into a silent daily dialogue. Each glance became a form of communication, a check-in with the woman I had met on that transformative Tuesday. I would look into her eyes and ask, without words, "How are we doing today?" And she, in her stillness, would answer. Her reflection became a language I was slowly learning to understand. A furrowed brow spoke of unspoken anxieties that were churning just beneath the surface. A tightness around the mouth was a clear sign that I had been holding back my truth, biting my tongue to maintain a fragile peace. The look in her eyes told me everything I needed to know about the state of my inner world. This dialogue was profoundly intimate, a conversation just for the two of us, the me that navigated the world and the deeper self that the mirror now so clearly reflected. She became my anchor and my conscience. Before leaving the house, I would meet her gaze, a silent promise to try and honor her, to remember she was there. At the end of a long day, I would return to the mirror, and her reflection would tell me how we had fared. Some days her eyes looked clear and calm, and I would feel a quiet sense of victory. We had made it through the day with our integrity intact. We had spoken a difficult truth, or set a necessary boundary, or simply allowed ourselves a moment of rest. On other days, the reflection was harder to meet. I would see the old weariness creeping back in, the familiar veil of exhaustion dimming the light in her eyes. And in those moments, there was no judgment from her, only a quiet, knowing sadness. Her look was not one of disappointment, but of gentle reminder. "This is what it costs us," her gaze seemed to say. "This is the price of forgetting." This feedback was invaluable. It was not a scolding, but a course correction. It helped me to see the direct, tangible impact of my choices, making it harder to slip into unconscious self-betrayal. The dialogue was a constant, gentle call to awareness. Through this silent conversation, I began to rebuild trust with myself. For years, I had ignored her whispers, and she had grown silent. Now, by listening to the language of her reflection, I was showing her that I was ready to pay attention. I was ready to value her wisdom. The mirror was the bridge between my conscious mind and my buried intuition. It was the place where the two halves of myself could finally meet, communicate, and begin the slow, delicate process of integrating back into a single, whole person. Every glance was a stitch, slowly mending the tear that had separated me from myself for so long. One of the most profound lessons the mirror taught me was the power of self-compassion. For years I had looked at my reflection with a harshly critical eye, cataloguing every flaw, every imperfection, every sign of weakness. I saw the parts of myself I was ashamed of as jagged, broken edges that needed to be hidden or fixed. My anxiety, my sensitivity, my moments of doubt, I saw these as personal failings, ugly marks on my character. I was ashamed of them, and that shame was reflected back at me as a hard, unforgiving glare. But as I continued my quiet dialogue with the woman in the mirror, something began to shift. As I learned to look with curiosity instead of criticism, the reflection itself seemed to change. The parts I was once so ashamed of began to soften. The worry lines on my forehead no longer looked like failures of composure. They looked like the marks of a person who cared deeply, who thought and felt with intensity. The sensitivity in my eyes, which I had long mistaken for weakness, now looked like a source of empathy and connection. The tiredness was not a sign of defeat, but a testament to the battles I had fought and survived. The mirror was teaching me to reframe my own story, to see my perceived flaws not as weaknesses, but as evidence of a life fully lived. This softening was an internal process that was reflected externally. As I began to treat myself with more kindness, to forgive myself for not being perfect, the tension in my face began to release its grip. The hard, defensive lines around my mouth and eyes started to melt away, replaced by a new gentleness. I was literally becoming softer, more open, more approachable, both to myself and to the world. The jagged edges were not being erased, they were being integrated. They were becoming part of a more complex and beautiful whole, their sharpness smoothed by the gentle tide of self-acceptance. I learned that what I had feared, my vulnerability, my imperfections, were not things to be conquered or eliminated. They were parts of me that simply needed to be held with compassion. The woman in the mirror was not asking me to be perfect. She was asking me to be whole. She was asking me to accept all the parts of myself, the light and the shadow, the strength and the struggle. The softening was a sign that I was finally listening. It was the visual proof that healing was taking place, not by cutting away the parts I didn't like, but by learning to love the person who contained them all. As the shame and fear receded, a new space was created within me. It was a quiet, fertile ground where things that had been dormant for years could finally begin to grow. The mirror started to show me things I had never noticed before, parts of myself that had been overshadowed by my relentless focus on a curated persona. I began to notice a playful glint in my eye that would appear after a moment of genuine, uninhibited laughter. I saw a certain confidence in my posture on days when I had successfully defended a boundary. These were the parts of me that had been there all along, waiting patiently in the wings, unseen and unacknowledged. It was like discovering a secret garden I never knew I possessed. The more I looked with an open and accepting heart, the more these hidden aspects of myself felt safe enough to emerge. The creative spark I thought had died long ago began to show itself in a new curiosity, a desire to try new things, to learn and to play. The adventurous spirit I had buried under layers of practicality started to whisper of future travels and new experiences. The mirror became a place where I would catch glimpses of these blooming parts, like seeing the first crocuses push through the snow after a long winter. It was a sign of life, of resilience, of a spring that was finally arriving in my soul. The reflection I had once feared was now becoming a source of wonder and delight. Who was this person with the mischievous smile? Where did this quiet strength in her shoulders come from? I was getting to know myself all over again, not as the flawed person I had always believed myself to be, but as a complex, multifaceted being with hidden depths and surprising capacities. The girl from beneath the surface was no longer a prisoner. She was being invited out to play. Her energy was beginning to infuse the woman in the mirror, bringing with it a lightness and a vibrancy I had not felt in years. This blooming was a quiet, internal process. It wasn't about making grand, sweeping changes to my life. It was about the small, subtle shifts that allowed more of my authentic self to see the light of day. It was choosing to spend an hour drawing instead of answering emails. It was speaking up in a meeting with an idea I might have previously kept to myself. It was allowing myself to be silly, to be spontaneous, to be messy. Each small act of authenticity was like a drop of water on a dormant seed, and the mirror was the place where I could witness the slow, miraculous, and beautiful bloom. The journey of becoming what I feared was ultimately a journey toward honoring my unpolished self. For so long, honestly, my life had been an exercise in sanding down my own edges, in presenting a smooth, polished, finished product to the world. I believed that my value lay in my perfection, my competence, my ability to appear flawless and in control. The person I feared was the one who was messy, uncertain, vulnerable, and incomplete. She was the rough draft, the work in progress, and I had been, terrified of letting anyone, including myself, see her. The mirror became the sacred space where I finally gave her permission to exist. Honoring this unpolished self meant letting go of the need for approval. It meant accepting that I would not always be understood, that my choices might not always be popular, and that my truth might make some people uncomfortable. The woman in the mirror was not seeking validation from anyone outside of herself. Her steady gaze was a reminder that the only approval I truly needed was my own. To honor her was to prioritize my own well-being over the comfort of others, to listen to my own intuition even when it contradicted conventional wisdom, and to stand by my own side, especially on the days when I felt I was failing. This process involved embracing imperfection as a natural and beautiful part of being human. I began to see the days when I was tired or sad, not as failures, but as necessary parts of my cycle. I learned to honor my need for rest, to respect my limits, and to be gentle with myself when I stumbled. The reflection I once feared, the one with the tired eyes and the sad smile, was now the one I was learning to care for. I would look at her, and instead of judgment, I would feel a wave of tenderness. "You are tired," I would acknowledge silently. "Let's rest." It was a radical act of self-care, a complete reversal of my old way of being. The reflection I feared was the one that was most true. It was the unedited, unfiltered, raw version of me, and becoming her meant stripping away the artifice, letting the mask fall, and standing in the simple, unadorned truth of my own being. It was terrifying and it was liberating. It was the process of finally choosing authenticity over performance. The mirror no longer showed me a stranger to be feared, but a self to be honored, a self that was beautifully, imperfectly, and completely whole. The fear had been the fear of my own truth, and becoming what I feared was simply the act of finally coming home. In the end, the woman I saw in the mirror, the one I had been so afraid of becoming, was not an enemy or a failure. She was my destiny. She was the person I was always meant to grow into, stripped of the illusions and expectations that had held me captive for so long. She was the product of her experiences, the sum of her joys and her sorrows, the keeper of her own hard-won wisdom. The fear was simply the resistance of the ego, the part of me that clung to the safety of the known, the comfort of the mask. Becoming her was not a surrender, it was an arrival. It was the culmination of a long journey back to the person I was born to be. The reflection I once feared was the one who was finally free. She was free from the exhausting burden of pretending. She was free from the relentless pursuit of other people's approval. She was free from the harsh judgment of her own inner critic. Her stillness was not emptiness, but deep and abiding peace. Her weariness was not defeat, but the honorable battle scar of a soul who had fought its way back to the light. The fear had been a misunderstanding, a misinterpretation of the signs. I thought I was afraid of breaking down, but I was actually on the verge of breaking through. I realized that we often fear the very transformations that are essential for our growth. We fear the shedding of an old skin because we don't yet know what the new one will look like. We fear the pain of healing because we have grown accustomed to the familiar ache of our wounds. I had been afraid of the woman in the mirror because she represented a profound and necessary change, an upheaval of the life I had so carefully constructed. She was the revolution, and I had been clinging to the old regime. But her quiet, persistent presence eventually won me over, not through force, but through the undeniable truth in her gaze. And so the reflection I once feared was now the one I was learning to inhabit, to embody, to become. It was a slow and imperfect process, a daily practice of choosing her over the old habits of hiding. But with each choice, I felt myself growing more solid, more real, more aligned. The chasm between my inner self and my outer presentation was closing. The mirror didn't change. I did. I grew into the reflection that had been waiting for me all along. I was becoming what I had feared, and I was discovering, to my profound relief and quiet joy, that it was exactly who I was meant to be. Sometimes the most profound healing does not announce itself with trumpets and fanfare. It does not arrive in a single cathartic breakthrough or a dramatic, life-altering event. Instead, it happens in the quiet, unassuming moments of our daily lives, in the spaces between the noise and the hustle. Healing for me began in stolen glances. It was the work of brief, intentional pauses in front of the mirror, moments snatched from the relentless forward momentum of my day. These were not long, soul-searching sessions of deep contemplation, but simple, fleeting check-ins, like a hand gently placed on a friend's shoulder to ask, "Are you okay?" It was in these small, repeated gestures that the real transformation took root, quietly and almost imperceptibly. These stolen glances became a new kind of ritual, replacing the old habit of avoidance. While brushing my teeth, I would allow my eyes to lift and meet my own gaze for just a few seconds longer than felt comfortable. While washing my hands, I would look up and acknowledge the person there, offering a silent nod of recognition. It was a practice of micro-dosing courage, of building a new relationship with my reflection, one tiny, brave moment at a time. Each glance was a small rebellion against the years of looking away, a quiet declaration that I was no longer afraid to see and to be seen. It was a gentle re-acclimatization to my own presence, a slow and steady process of befriending the woman in the glass. The healing was not in what I saw during these glances, but in the act of looking itself. The simple willingness to be present with myself without judgment or agenda was the medicine. It was an act of profound kindness, a gesture that communicated, "You are worthy of my attention, you are worthy of being seen." This quiet work began to subtly rewire my brain, dismantling the old pathways of fear and self-criticism and forging new ones of curiosity and compassion. It was not a grand overhaul, but a gentle renovation of my inner world, happening one stolen glance at a time, building a foundation of self-acceptance so slowly that I barely noticed the structure taking shape. This process taught me that healing isn't always about doing more. Sometimes it's about being more. It is about being present for your own life, even in its most mundane moments. The mirror, once a site of conflict, was becoming a sanctuary for these quiet acts of self-reconnection. The stolen glances were like seeds planted in the dark, fertile soil of my newfound awareness. I didn't need to see them sprout immediately. I just needed to trust that the quiet, consistent work of showing up for myself was enough, and that in time, something beautiful and strong would grow from these small, courageous beginnings. The journey of healing is often watered by tears, but not always the kind that come from loud, heaving sobs. Sometimes the most transformative tears are the ones you don't even notice you are crying. They are the silent, solitary tears that well up in your eyes and trace a slow, warm path down your cheek while you are standing in front of the mirror. They are not tears of a specific, identifiable sorrow, but tears of a deeper, more ambiguous origin. These are the tears of recognition, of release, of a grief you never knew you were carrying. It's the soul's quiet way of letting go of years of accumulated pain, tension, and self-abandonment. I remember standing before the mirror one evening, just looking, when I felt that familiar, stinging sensation in my eyes. A single tear escaped and rolled down my face. I didn't wipe it away. I just watched it in the reflection, a glistening track on my skin. I wasn't sad in that moment, not in the traditional sense. I was just still. The tear felt less like an expression of sadness and more like a physical manifestation of a dam breaking somewhere deep inside me. It was the release of all the unspoken words, the unfelt emotions, the quiet betrayals I had inflicted upon myself for so long. It was the pain of the hidden girl finally being allowed to surface and be seen. These unnoticed tears became a recurring part of my healing process. They would arrive without warning, often in moments of quiet reflection. They were not dramatic or overwhelming, but gentle and cleansing, They were the mirror's way of showing me that I was finally creating enough safety within myself for the deepest wounds to begin to weep. Each tear was a quiet validation of the pain that had been stored away, unacknowledged for years. It was as if my body was finally releasing the pressure that had been building for a lifetime, one silent drop at a time. These were not tears of weakness, but of profound strength and resilience. In a world that often encourages us to suppress our tears, to be strong and hold it together, the mirror gave me a private, sacred space to let them fall. It taught me that healing is not about avoiding pain, but about creating a compassionate space for it to be felt and released. The tears I didn't even notice were the quiet evidence that the space was being built. They were the gentle rain in my inner garden, washing away the dust of neglect and allowing the new seeds of self-compassion to take root. They were the holy water of my own quiet, personal baptism into a new way of being. A significant turning point in my healing journey was the day I declared a ceasefire with perfection. For most of my life, I had been at war with my own humanity, relentlessly striving for an impossible ideal. The mirror was the battlefield where I surveyed the damage, constantly finding fault with the soldier staring back at me. She was never enough, never composed enough, never successful enough, never thin enough, never perfect enough. This internal war was utterly exhausting, and it was the source of the deep weariness I saw etched into my own face. The healing could not truly begin until I was willing to lay down my arms and accept a truce. This ceasefire was not a surrender to mediocrity, but a surrender to reality. It was the recognition that the quest for perfection was a trap, a self-imposed prison that kept me in a constant state of striving and anxiety. It was the understanding that my worth was not contingent on my ability to be flawless. Healing began when I stopped looking in the mirror for a perfect version of myself and started to look for the real one. It was a radical shift in perspective from seeking flawlessness to seeking wholeness. It was about accepting the entire landscape of myself, the sunlit peaks, the shadowy valleys, and the messy, untamed wilderness in between. The mirror became the place where I practiced this new peace. I would look at my reflection and consciously let go of the need to fix what I saw. I would see the tired eyes, and instead of launching an internal critique, I would offer a silent message of acceptance. It is okay to be tired. I would see a new wrinkle, and instead of despairing, I would try to see it as a line from a story, a map of a life lived. This practice was difficult at first, like trying to speak a foreign language. The voice of the inner critic was loud and insistent. But with each small act of acceptance, its power began to wane, and a quieter, kinder voice began to emerge. This ceasefire with perfection brought an incredible sense of relief. It was like setting down a heavy burden I didn't even realize I had been carrying. The energy I had once expended on self-criticism and the pursuit of an impossible ideal was now freed up for other things, for joy, for creativity, for connection, for rest. The mirror was no longer a place of battle, but a place of peace. It reflected a person who was not perfect, but who was at peace with her own imperfection, and in that reflection, I found a beauty that was far more profound and enduring than the flawless image I had chased for so long. The core of healing with the mirror was a slow, deliberate shift from looking for an idealized future self to recognizing the person who was right here, right now. For years, my gaze had been fixed on a phantom, a version of me that was always just out of reach. She was the me who would finally be happy when she lost the weight, got the promotion, or found the perfect partner. I was so focused on becoming her that I completely overlooked the person I already was. The healing began when I finally stopped looking past my own reflection and started to truly see the woman who was standing there in the present moment. Recognizing the present one meant acknowledging her reality without judgment. It meant seeing her tiredness, her uncertainty, her imperfections, and not turning away. It meant accepting that this is who I am today, not who I was yesterday, and not who I hope to be tomorrow, but who I am in this very moment. This practice of radical presence was incredibly grounding. It pulled me out of the anxious fantasies of the future and the regretful ghosts of the past and anchored me firmly in the truth of the now. The present woman was not a before picture waiting for an after. She was the entire story. This recognition was an act of profound validation. By truly seeing the present one, I was telling her that she was enough just as she was. Her existence was not conditional. Her worth was not pending. She did not need to change or improve to be deserving of love and acceptance. This message, delivered silently through my own gaze, was the antidote to years of self-rejection. It was a homecoming, a return to the self that had been waiting patiently for me to stop searching for someone better and finally notice her. It was in this simple recognition that the deepest healing occurred. The mirror became a portal to the present moment. Each time I looked, it was an opportunity to practice this recognition. It was a chance to say hello to the person I was today, with all her complexities and contradictions. Healing, I learned, is not about becoming a new person. It is about becoming reacquainted with the person you have been all along. It is about peeling back the layers of who you think you should be and finally, gratefully, recognizing the one who is. The present one was the only one who was real, and learning to see her, honor her, and love her was the greatest healing of all. As my healing progressed, the mirror's role in my life underwent its final, most beautiful transformation. It had been an accuser, a teacher, and a guide. Now it became a witness. It was no longer a tool for self-assessment or a catalyst for change, but simply a silent, compassionate presence that bore witness to my existence. It was a place where I could show up in any state, joyful, grieving, angry, peaceful, messy, or radiant, and simply be seen without any expectation or agenda. It became a space of pure, unconditional witnessing, and in that space I found a profound sense of safety and belonging. To be witnessed is a fundamental human need. We long to be seen for who we truly are, to have our experience acknowledged and validated. For so long, I had sought this validation from the outside world, contorting myself into different shapes in the hope of being seen and approved of. The mirror taught me that the most powerful form of witness is the one we can offer ourselves. To stand before the mirror and witness my own joy To see the light in my own eyes after a happy moment and acknowledge it, there you are, joy, was just as important as witnessing my own pain. The mirror as a witness created a space for radical honesty. There was no one to perform for, no one to impress. I could bring my truest, most vulnerable self to the glass and know that she would be held in a gaze of pure acceptance. This practice of self-witnessing cultivated a deep sense of inner trust and resilience. I learned that I could hold my own experiences, that I didn't need to run from my feelings or distract myself from my reality. I could be my own anchor in the storms of life, my own steady presence in moments of uncertainty. The mirror simply reflected this growing capacity back to me. This final stage of healing was not about striving for anything. It was about arriving. It was about being. The mirror was no longer a place I went to in order to do something, to fix, to change, to improve. It was a place I went to in order to be present, to be seen, to be witnessed by the one person whose opinion now mattered most, my own. It was no longer a mirror of judgment, but a mirror of grace. It simply reflected the truth of my being, and in that reflection I found not fear, but a quiet, abiding, and deeply healing love. There is a unique quality to the reflections we see late at night. The world outside is hushed. The demands of the day have been met, and the masks we wear for others have been set aside. In the soft glow of a single lamp, the mirror offers a different kind of truth, one that is gentler and more intimate than the harsh light of day. It is in these late-night reflections that some of the deepest healing can occur. The stillness of the hour creates a sanctuary, a space where the soul feels safe enough to reveal its most tender, vulnerable aspects. It is a time for quiet communion with the self. In these quiet hours, I would often find myself standing before the mirror, not with any specific purpose, but drawn by a need for a final, gentle check-in. The face that looked back at me was often tired, stripped of the day's makeup and pretenses. It was my most unadorned self, and it was here in this raw and honest state that I felt the most profound connection. The woman in the glass was not the polished professional or the accommodating friend. She was just a soul weary from the day, seeking a moment of peace, and I could offer it to her with a simple, compassionate. The late-night reflections became a time for gratitude and forgiveness. I would silently thank the woman in the mirror for getting us through another day, for her strength, her resilience, her effort. I would also offer forgiveness for the moments when we fell short, when we lost our patience, or when we forgot to be kind to ourselves. This simple nightly ritual of gratitude and forgiveness was incredibly powerful. It was a way of closing the day with grace, of releasing any lingering judgment, and of affirming that no matter what had happened, we were still whole, still worthy, still on the same team. These moments were the quiet bedrock of my healing. They taught me that our relationship with ourselves is not built in grand gestures, but in the small, consistent acts of kindness we offer in the stillness of the night. It is in the willingness to meet our own tired eyes with love, to witness our own vulnerability with compassion, and to end each day with a quiet promise to begin again tomorrow. The late night reflection is a final, loving glance that says, "We made it. Rest now." It is a benediction, a blessing offered to the self, and one of the most profound forms of healing I have ever known. For so many years, I believed the mirror was the problem. I saw it as a flawed, cruel object, a surface that distorted my image, magnified my insecurities, and reflected a version of me that was harsh and unforgiving. I directed my fear, my anxiety, and my avoidance toward this inanimate object, believing that if only the reflection were different, my suffering would cease. I wished for it to show me a kinder face, a more confident posture, a less weary soul. I waited for the mirror to change, to one day offer me an image that I could finally love, an image that would grant me permission to feel at peace with myself. It was a long and fruitless wait, a vigil kept for a miracle that would never arrive. The profound, earth-shattering truth that I had to learn was this: the mirror did not change. It never did. It was and always had been a neutral surface of glass and silver, faithfully and dispassionately reflecting whatever was placed before it. It held no agenda, passed no judgment, and offered no opinion. Its function was simple, honest, and unwavering. It reflected the light it was given. It showed what was there. The distortion I perceived, the cruelty I felt, the judgment I feared, none of it originated in the glass. It all came from me. The mirror was simply the messenger, and I had been blaming it for the news it delivered from my own inner world. The change, when it finally came, was not in the object of my fear, but in the subject of the reflection. The transformation was entirely internal. I was the one who changed. I was the one who learned to soften my gaze, to quiet the inner critic, to approach my own image with curiosity instead of condemnation. I was the one who dismantled the walls of performance and politeness, allowing a more authentic self to emerge. I was the one who chose to stop fighting, to lay down the weapons of self-judgment, and to declare a lasting peace with my own imperfect humanity. The mirror simply bore witness to this slow, quiet, and profound revolution of the self. And as I changed, the reflection changed with me. The image it showed me was no longer that of a weary stranger or a harsh critic. It began to reflect a person I was getting to know, someone I was learning to trust and even to love. It reflected the softness that came from self-compassion, the light that returned to my eyes with newfound joy, and the quiet strength that grew from a place of deep self-acceptance. The mirror had not altered its nature in any way. It was I who had altered mine, and in doing so, I had transformed the very world that it reflected back to me, proving that the reality we see is always and only a reflection of the one we hold within. With this profound shift in understanding, the mirror was no longer a place of judgment. The cold clinical courtroom where I had once been both defendant and prosecutor was transformed into something sacred. It became a place of reunion. It was the designated meeting point for the two halves of myself that had been separated for so long. The person I presented to the world and the true essential self I had hidden away. The mirror became the safe harbor where the exiled part of me could finally come home, where the girl with the fire in her eyes could be reintroduced to the woman who had learned to survive without her. It was a space for integration, for wholeness, for making peace. Each time I stood before it, I was facilitating this reunion. It was a conscious act of bringing all my parts together in one place under a gaze of unconditional acceptance. I brought my strength and my vulnerability, my joy and my sorrow, my confidence and my doubt. I allowed them all to exist simultaneously, to be seen and to be acknowledged in the reflection. There was no longer a need to hide the tired parts or to perform the strong ones. The mirror became a space where I could be completely, messianically, and unapologetically myself, and the person looking back was the compassionate witness to this quiet daily homecoming. This sense of reunion brought with it a profound feeling of relief and a deep, resonant peace. The exhaustion that had plagued me for years began to dissipate because the internal war was over. The immense energy I had expended on keeping myself divided, on policing the borders between my inner and outer worlds, was now liberated. I was no longer fighting a civil war. I was presiding over a peace treaty, a gentle and loving reunification of a fractured kingdom. The woman in the mirror was no longer a stranger or a warden. She was my oldest friend, the one who had been waiting patiently for me to remember her, the one who welcomed me home with open arms. The mirror then became a testament to this newfound wholeness. It reflected back a person who was more integrated, more solid, more present. The chasm that had once existed between who I was and who I pretended to be was slowly closing, stitched together by these daily moments of reunion. It was no longer a place of confrontation, but of communion. It was a quiet, sacred altar where I could honor the complexity of my own being and celebrate the slow, beautiful process of becoming whole again. The reflection was no longer something to be feared. It was a beloved face, a familiar soul, a friend I was getting to know all over again. The journey did not end with reunion. It began a new chapter of conscious becoming. The person I had once feared, the unpolished, vulnerable, authentic woman, was no longer a threat to be managed or a flaw to be hidden. I came to understand that she was the very person I was always meant to become. She was not a lesser version of me. She was the most essential version. The fear I had felt was simply the natural resistance to shedding a skin that had grown too tight, the apprehension before a great and necessary leap into a more honest way of living. It was the fear that always precedes true liberation, the darkness that comes just before the dawn. Embracing this self meant actively choosing her every single day in small and significant ways. It meant choosing her voice over the desire for consensus, her needs over the demands of others, her truth over the comfort of a convenient lie. It was a daily practice of alignment, of checking in with the woman in the mirror and asking, what choice would honor you today? Sometimes the answer was to speak up, and sometimes it was to stay silent and rest. Sometimes it was to be bold and adventurous, and other times it was to be quiet and gentle. The key was to listen to her wisdom, to trust her guidance over the noisy instructions of the outside world. This embrace was an act of profound courage. It meant disappointing some people. It meant changing the dynamics of some relationships. It meant walking away from situations and expectations that no longer served the whole and authentic person I was becoming. It required a deep and abiding faith in my own worth, a trust that living as my true self was more important than fitting into boxes that were never meant for me. It was the ultimate act of self-love, a declaration that my primary responsibility was to the soul that looked back at me from the mirror each morning. And so, what I feared most became my greatest strength, The vulnerability I had tried to hide became the source of my deepest connections. The sensitivity I had labeled as weakness became my most powerful tool for empathy and understanding. The quietness I had mistaken for passivity became a wellspring of inner peace and resilience. By turning to face the reflection I had so long avoided, by walking toward the fear instead of away from it, I had not found the failure I expected. I had found my most authentic, powerful, and integrated self. I had become the mirror I once feared, and in doing so, I had finally found my way home. The journey with the mirror is not a destination at which one arrives, but a path that one continues to walk. Healing is not a final state to be achieved, but an ongoing process, a continuous conversation with the self. The mirror remains my partner in this dialogue. It is a lifelong practice of checking in, of listening, and of course, correcting with gentleness and compassion. There are still days when the tired woman looks back at me, when the old habits of self-criticism whisper at the edges of my mind. The difference now is that I do not fear her, I do not turn away. I see her as a signal, a gentle messenger reminding me to come back to myself. This ongoing conversation is a commitment to awareness. It is the promise I make to myself each day to stay present, to notice when I am slipping into old patterns of performance or people-pleasing, and to gently guide myself back to a place of authenticity. The mirror is my touchstone, the place I return to remember who I am and what I am striving for. Not perfection, but wholeness. It is a relationship that requires nurturing like any other. It thrives on consistency, on honesty, and on the unwavering belief that the person in the reflection is always worthy of love and attention, no matter what she looks like on any given day. The fear may never vanish completely, because to be human is to be vulnerable, and to be vulnerable is to sometimes feel afraid. But the fear no longer has power over me. It is not the ruler of my inner kingdom. It is merely a visitor, a passing weather system in the vast sky of my being. I can acknowledge its presence without letting it dictate my actions. The woman in the mirror has taught me that I am more expansive than any single emotion, more resilient than any single failure. Our ongoing conversation has built a foundation of self-trust that is stronger than any passing storm of fear or doubt. And so the mirror hangs on my wall, no longer a geography to be navigated around, but a quiet sanctuary to be visited. It is a place of witness, of reunion, and of a gentle, unending conversation. It reminds me that the most important relationship I will ever have is the one with the person looking back at me. Because sometimes the thing we fear most, the raw, honest, unfiltered truth of who we are, is not only what we were meant to become, but the very source of our deepest healing, our greatest strength, and our most profound and lasting peace. The mirror did not change. I did, and that has made all the difference.